we're going to get right on with our next presentation. I'm going to introduce Peter Hirshberg, who's our board chair at Gray Area, and also has been a great help in the sort of conceptualization and construction of this exhibition, with a touch on a lot of the pieces in the McLuhan exhibition in particularly. And he will be giving a quick framing presentation, and then we will bring in Hans Ulrich Obrist, who's the artistic director at Serpentine Galleries, and Paola Antonelli, who's the senior curator in the design and architecture department at MoMA, New York, as well as the founding director of their research and development program.
Are we ready?
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Are we ready? All right, I warmed them up for you.
Since we're gathered here in the Cathedral of McLuhan, why don't we start by going back to 1967 as he presages where we are today. And naturally, it is the medium that is dictating what we're doing because we're getting this to work. 1976, he was on the Today Show. There had been a debate between Ford and Carter. I'm ready to go when you are. Mm-hmm. The sound stopped for 10 minutes. And I asked him about this. He explains it was the revenge of the medium against the bloody message because the debate was ridiculous. Okay, now we can start.
The electric age.
There's no audio playing.
Changing you. It is changing your family. It is changing your neighborhood. It's changing your education. It's changing your job. When this circuit learns your job, what are you going to do?
The dangers are total. The chances of your understanding anything going on in your own time are very small, except through the means of media provided by artists. Artists are people who enjoy living in the present. The artist is always a jump ahead of technology and is engaged really in giving you images of what sort of effects it's likely to have upon you later on. Pop art simply tells you the only art form left for you today is your own natural environment. You have now to program it as if it were a work of art and an environment. So to suddenly be confronted with the need to use the human environment itself as art form is one way of drawing attention to the fact that the new environments created by new media require a certain amount of human programming and control for our psychic life.
That was from a 1967 piece that he did. Am I okay, or do I have to mute something? All right, good. Well, you know, the reason we're doing this show as distant early warning is we're really taking a look at the strategic role of the arts in helping move society forward, because too often they're dismissed as just something pretty as opposed to a real partner in developing technology or culture. This, of course, was the origin of the distant early warning newsletter that McLuhan did and the reason we're doing our show. It's interesting to go back and ask, where did McLuhan get this from? How did it rise in the 20th century? 1934, Ezra Pound writes the ABCs of Reading, and in it, he writes that artists are the antenna of the race. Oh, we're going to go back and do something. Are we adding Hans Ulrich? Okay, I'll just continue here. Artists are the antenna of the race. So Pound basically says, who pays attention? This is right next to, can you be interested in the writings of men whose perceptions are below average? But this hit McLuhan. Another big influence on McLuhan was Wyndham Lewis, who actually said, you know, the earth has become a giant village. But it was Lewis who also saw that with technological changes, our society, who we were as beings, might be changing. McLuhan starts up a correspondence with Pound. It's not clear that Pound was reading, but McLuhan, after being in graduate school in 34, is now a professor, and he has now declared himself, having watched this media environment, that he will be an intellectual thug who has slowly been accumulating a private arsenal with every intention of using it. In a mindless age, every insight takes on the character of a lethal weapon. And then he even goes on and talks about radio and print in his day. And he says that those things are hypnotizing us, putting us in a spell there's radio and news and commercials. He wants to work on that problem. The word is the cheapest and most universal drug. So what we've been talking about now, how media can control us and represent power environments, he's decided this is what he has to do. And in that same letter, he refers to Wyndham Lewis, who wrote some really provocative stuff, and he goes, you know, everybody of goodwill in society is just dismissed. Wyndham Lewis writes his piece, and the impact was nil. We resent or we ignore intellectuals. And if you were like Roger McNamee or Yael Eisenstadt in Facebook or Francis Hagen trying to blow a whistle when people weren't listening to you, you would sympathize with McLuhan early in his career when he saw that there was not intelligent criticism going on. Of course, by 64, he writes Understanding Media, and that's the year that he starts talking about art as a distant early warning signal. By the way, by 65, Tom Wolfe, writing about him, asked the fundamental question, what if he's right? What if he sounds like the most important thinker since Newton, Darwin, Freud, Einstein, or Pavlov, right? So he was on this kind of rocketing up plane because he knew how to communicate. But I want to ground us in what it was like in the 1960s, in the middle of the Cold War, when he uses this distant early warning metaphor, because that was about the thing that was on people's minds the most. So it was a powerful way for him to connect up what artists did and his own warnings. Oh, this, by the way, is what the distant early warning line looked like. It was a bunch of antennas up in the north that would basically tell us what's going on, that then got fed into a computer that would help make decisions.
What was once the impassable Arctic now provides the quickest routes for attack from a wide sector of Europe and Asia. Beset by the nightmare of this threat, the nation's leaders decided on a tremendous undertaking. This was to build, with the cooperation of Canada, a radar early warning line north of the Arctic Circle. Starting at the northernmost tip of Alaska, it would stretch 3,000 miles across the continent to Baffin Island, opposite Greenland. Distant Early Warning Line, they named it. Dew Line, it became.
It is to meet this threat that the Air Force has been developing SAGE, the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment System, to strengthen our air defenses. This new computer, built to become the nerve center of a defense network, is able to perform all the complex mathematical problems involved in countering a mass enemy raid. It is provided with its own powerhouse, containing large diesel-driven generators, air conditioning equipment, and cooling towers required to cool the thousands of vacuum tubes in the computer.
The combination of the early warning system and the computer cost more than the Manhattan Project, consumed about a quarter of all the programmers in the country. It was a major focus. And so McLuhan used that same early warning metaphor in his work. And then in 1968 launches a newsletter for leaders in industry, basically saying, you know, the government's paying attention to what the Soviets are doing. No one's paying attention to what we're doing to ourselves with new media. You should understand. And the language he uses is great. He says his newsletter will be shocking, startling, a monthly early warning system for our era of instant change. And it's written for the man or woman of responsibility who cannot afford to be wrong in his evaluation of the present or prediction of the future. It's designed to reveal and analyze the vast underground transforming forces you must deal with in the dazzling different world of tomorrow. The disruption and concern of that era, very similar to the moment that we're in today. And then the language he uses to alarm people into subscribing. Which of these danger signals have you already interpreted falsely? Which of these technological breakthroughs are completely hidden from your view? Then he kind of goes through what's going on today. And you can see a lot of this in the exhibit. His newsletter then highlighted many, many things, including the role of the arts as antenna, arts and copyright, arts and fraud. You could actually think he presaged NFTs in some of the stuff. we were very fortunate to get a hold of a recording that Marshall McLuhan made with Tony Schwartz, who was both a very close friend of Marshall McLuhan and a mentor of mine, who actually recorded Tony talking about the artist in the early 70s. And I want to share some of that with you today. We've compressed it in a format that McLuhan and Tony Schwartz developed called mnemonic speech, where we kind of overlay things so that they pour into you in acoustic space as opposed to the linear print world.
The only person who dare encounter the unknown, the new, directly, the Gorgon.
Can we volume up?
The only person who dare encounter the unknown, the new, directly, the Gorgon, without a mirror, is the artist. Artists in any age are experts in direct encounter with the present, and they report their probings and findings in all sorts of grotesque designs. What the pop artists are telling us is that the environment itself has now become a work of art. That is a direct probe of a new electronic situation. Understand the process by which you got trapped, and you're out. The artist is the only person who is prepared to face the present, and therefore to tell us about the future, because as our friend, Father Calkins, my friend Jerry Fagan says, the future of the future is the present. This was always true, but very few people dare look at the present. I don't think it comes easy to people in any period. Never heard of anybody except artists who could do it. And the artist does it because he's prepared to use his senses as scientific instruments instead of just using them as pick-up devices for his own satisfaction. He is engaged in a critique of satisfaction. He's willing to put aside or reject all satisfaction in order to discover and probe.
This kind of came to a head in 1969. McLuhan goes to the Bilderberg Conference, which has kings, CEOs, heads of state, and it turns out he went over like a lead balloon because they basically didn't understand what he was talking about, and he concluded that because they didn't have an artistic training, they did not have an antenna, they couldn't sense what was going on. And then he says the great advantage of going here is it gives me a way of estimating the level of incompetence to which the world leaders have attained. Every man has a right to protect his ignorance, but these are the ones responsible for dealing with a changing world. And this kind of shows you the degree to which he was ahead of people and the power establishment wasn't that happy. I'm going to show one more slide. By the time we get out towards the end of his life, 1979, he begins to realize that we're moving into this completely electronic environment that will change us. Kind of hooks up with some of Tellier de Chardin's ideas of the noosphere. Here's the last public lecture that he gave, in which he's actually thinking about the service environments of these new technologies. And then we're going to go to our panel.
Any new service environment such as that created by railways or motor cars or telegraph or radio deeply modify the very nature and image of the people who use them. Radical changes of identity happening in very sudden, brief intervals of time have proved more deadly and destructive to human values than were wars fought with hardware weapons. In the electric age, the alteration of human identity by new service environments of information have left whole populations without personal or community values to a degree that far exceeds the effects of food and fuel and energy shortages.
That was very impressive. Okay, that was 1979. Why don't we bring up our panel now of Paola Antonelli and Hans Ulrich Obrist coming up on Zoom. And there's Paola, and do we have Hans Ulrich? He will be joining us shortly. Hello, Paola.
Ciao, Peter.
Ciao. Hey, I wanted to start with the fact you are the head of design at the Museum of Modern Art.
Well, no, I'm not the head of design.
You are the...
I'm a senior curator. I'm not really the head of anything except R&D. I'm the senior curator of architecture and design.
Thank you. You lead a lot of the design efforts at the Museum of Art, but you also gave yourself this title of the head of R&D. And that suggests that there's a role for the artists and for institutions that's well beyond aesthetics and helps drive change. Can you explain how that fits in?
Definitely. So in 2008, as we all know, there was a big financial crisis. And I had been at MoMA already for quite a few years, but before switching to architecture, I had studied economics for a while. So I had come to understand a little more of that world besides what you read. Hi, Hans Ulrich. Besides what you read in the business pages of the magazines and newspapers. So when 2008 happened, I saw an opportunity for cultural institutions to prove how important and necessary they were for society. You know, usually whenever there's a crisis, all governments always look to the financial sector, to the industrial sector for rescuing society, right? Too big to fail, too important to fail, too fast to fail, whatever you say. And instead, the cultural sector is the first that gets cut, heads roll, and all of a sudden it's the superfluity. Art is superfluous to society. In 2008, I thought that the financial sector finally had revealed its true colors, and we could see an opportunity there. So I remember going to Glenn Lowry and said, Glenn, we can do it. Let's open a department that proves to the world that museums and cultural institutions can be the R&D of society. They can provide the kind of slow progress that is dependable, like slow food. It's about nurturing local talent and then spreading to the world. It's about generosity. It's about collective action. It's about everything that we need right now to get ourselves out of this hole. And of course, at that time, we could not start a new department because we were all taking pay cuts so as not to lay off anyone, but we waited. And then we started this department, which, we can talk about it later, but it's the 10th anniversary of the MoMA R&D Salon series, which is the one that, in a way, tries to prove the idea that artists, curators, and the whole ecosystem and biodome that is inside a museum and around it can help society really deal with important matters at hand, including death, including aging, including war.
And this is, for us in Silicon Valley, this is a vital thing because, as we've seen, it's very easy for stuff to get built without a moral compass, without the kind of experimentation that artists might do, without that play as a guiding light. And I think that's one of the reasons we're doing what we're doing here. Hans Ulrich, welcome. And we're now going to work on Hans Ulrich's audio, but we're doing great so far. There we go. Welcome.
And now it's thundering.
So, Hans Ulrich, as you know, we've been having this convening on distant early warning, and we've been looking at the mechanisms by which McLuhan realized that artists had the antenna and the sensibility to both understand where we were going and also the ability to kind of think and forge for us. And I know that you, as a curator, have been using this metaphor a great deal. And I'm wondering if you could paint for us, do we see this mostly at work in emerging artists? Do you see this in artists in residence, in companies? Like, is this working today? Or are there things that we need to push further to kind of make sure this mentality is part of our society?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to participate in your great conference. And I wanted to begin actually with two models from the time of McLuhan, actually, which were a great inspiration for us at the Serpentine. One is, of course, Billy Kluwer's experiment in arts and technology. And a couple of years ago, I went to visit Lilian Schwarz, and a few years earlier, when he was still alive, I also met Billy Kluwer. And of course, the idea of such long duration collaboration where artists would literally have offices in a company like Bell Laboratories, a leading tech company at the time, is something which for us at the Serpentine was very inspiring. And we thought, actually, about 10 years ago with Ben Vickers, how could one actually from eat go to need, sort of start new experiments in art and technology. And we started for this reason with a tech department at the Serpentine to also not only actually produce work. I mean, we are working with several artists on games. The idea that actually artists can now, of course, more and more invent their own or work on their own games with a more accessibility of game engines, but also the idea of research, to actually within an institution do research. We started recently the Synthetic Ecologies Lab, which explores relationship between natural and artificial biological system. And with this entire department, which involves several curators, Alex Boyce, Tamar Clark-Brown, Victoria Ivanova, Eva Jäger, and Kay Watson, we developed these research projects. The second inspiration, so from eat to need, the second inspiration comes from a UK example from the same time as McLuhan. And that's, of course, the APG, the Artist Placement Group idea of John Latham and Barbara Stevini. John Latham and Barbara Stevini were close friends of mine when I moved to England, initially in the 90s, and then again when I joined the Serpentine in 2006. And we worked with them several times, also at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris. And this idea of APG, where actually artists would also have a seat at the table where decisions are made and where one would actually bring artists into society seems more important now than ever, and is something which is very important for us at the Serpentine to not only do projects with artists within the art institution, but to every day think about how these contents and these projects can actually enter society, how can we bring them into society. And what Latham and Stabini, in their wonderful APG idea, which at the time was sort of considered to be utopic, but I think today can easily be seen as a concrete utopia, we can actually realize was that they wanted that every corporation, every company, every brand, also every governmental structure has an artist in residence and eventually also an artist on the board.
Are you satisfied that as artists have become part of this power structure, that they're being heard and influencing? Because one of the big, we see good examples of this. For example, when Google was experimenting with deep dreams, they were fascinated for artists to bang against that black box to see what was going on, and we did an event with that here. But there are many other things that I think have come out recently where ethicists and biologists, say, are consulted, and the artists are treated, a little bit more preciously. I'm wondering how you see that going and how we can push that.
Yeah, I think it's important to further push it because indeed, many companies still don't do it at all. And but obviously, at the moment, when also with the, another aspect of our work besides the work with technology is, of course, that we work very strongly with environmental issues. We have a whole department also for ecology and the idea, for example, with our Back to Earth project is there again to kind of actually not only do projects at the gallery, in our Kunsthal, in our exhibition space, but also bring these artist campaigns, environmental campaigns into society. And of course, definitely there is so much more still to be done, but there is more openness now, I think, at this very moment, because more and more companies realize that they have to pivot. And of course, that gives a necessity also to bring different voices into the company. So we think it's a very good moment. But I think more so than just this APG idea, it is also just about new alliances. I think we can only solve the big challenges of the 21st century, the big dangers in technology, in the environment also, if we go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. And Isabelle Stengers, the wonderful Belgian philosopher, and wonderful scientist Ilya Prigozhin have written a book which is called Nouvelles Alliances, New Alliances. And I think we need to create alliances, collaborations between different institutions in the art world, outside the art world, and only that can actually, bring that change. And of course, these alliances are happening in a very interesting way in the space of gaming. It brings us in a way to our most recent focus really on video games. And in 2021, 2.8 billion people, and that's a third of the world population, have actually played video games, and that makes this niche pastime into somehow the biggest mass phenomenon of our time. And that, of course, means also that something Anna Antropy, in the wonderful book she wrote, actually, The Rise of the Video Game Dynasties, it's interesting because this book came out exactly 10 years ago. Anna Antropy wrote, what I want from video games is a plurality of voices. I want games to come from a wider set of experiences and present a wider range of perspectives. I can imagine, you're invited to imagine with me, you all are invited to imagine with me, about games are not manufactured for the same small audience, but one actually, which games are authored by you and me for the benefit of our peers, and of course, artists contribute very strongly to the plurality of voices and different perspectives by actually producing and distributing their own games. And so we started, for example, we work with Gabriel Massa now at the Serpentine on a game. And I also curated this year an exhibition which began in Düsseldorf at Julia Stoschek collection, where it is still ongoing for the next sort of 14, 15 months. And then in spring, the Centre Georges Pompidou in France, the Shigeru Ban building in Metz will actually show another version of this exhibition. And the idea is also that the exhibition will continue to grow and continue to evolve. And I think one of the things which is also important in the current scheme of things is that we think about how we can go beyond the short-termism of event culture, no? Of conferences, of exhibitions, and think about and all these basically events like biennales, exhibitions, and how we can actually think about more long-durational formats, projects on which we work for many years, which continue to evolve and grow. And of course, games very often, they are launched before they're even finished, feedback, and then they can evolve over many years. And I think that's true for many digital artworks. They have a very different time horizon often than exhibitions. And I think it's interesting to think about that, not only in the digital world, but also in the analog world. No, we think, for example, about many artists right now who decide that they'd rather think about gardens than about exhibitions. And of course, a garden has a completely different time horizon than an exhibition. And it's also not a coincidence that there is this fascinating pattern right now that you see artists a bit in the following of, someone like Gianfranco Baruchello, who is now in his 90s, the Italian artist, who since the 60s has started an agricultural association and works actually with a farm as an artist. And it's interesting that right now, Ottobon Nekanga and also Inka Shonibare, independently of each other, have actually decided to do farming projects in Nigeria. And of course, I was very fascinated by Paola, by your book you did with Alice Rawthorne. First of all, your amazing online activities throughout the lockdown, and now the book, where with Emergency we can really see, thanks to your book, so many examples for such projects which are not events, but which are long durational design projects. So the same happens not only in art, but as we can see through your wonderful book, also in design.
If we just put a bookmark there, and then I want to go to both of you. We've got several things on the table here. One is both of you have just mounted major shows on video games, which really then take us into the metaverse and living in an interactive space. The space we've designed, kind of coming from McLuhan, that's where we live. What's that doing to us? So I would love to hear from Paula and from both of you on both of your big exhibitions there. And then you've also pointed out that increasingly we realize we need biological systems. They're more efficient, they're regenerative. So, Paula, you've had shows on this. Hans Ulrich, you've just brought that up. And you mentioned Paula's book, Design Emergency, which was really how artists responded very entrepreneurially in a distributed way during the pandemic, because nobody kind of knew what to do. And so why don't we start with that? You cataloged a phenomenon that went on there. It really points out the porous borders between art and getting things done in the world.
So Design Emergency happened very, very organically. And thank you so much, Hans Ulrich and Peter, for bringing it up. So I was stuck in New York in lockdown with my husband, Larry, and we were just like both dumbfounded. And Larry was listening every night to Fat Joe, the hip hop artist, who was having this great Instagram lives with all of his friends that would last for hours. And one day Larry said, you could do that. And I'm like, well, I could do that. I could do it with Alice. And Alice is the foremost design critic in the world. And she's been my friend for 20 plus years. And we've been together, partners for many different, conferences and symposia, but we had never started a project together. And Alice has an incredible Instagram feed on design that she started many years ago that is basically an encyclopedia of design, and every day gives you fundamental vitamins and nutrients of design. And she had already started a whole series on the pandemic. So I called her up, I said, let's do it. We had a title in 10 minutes. Then we called another friend, Frit Kerr, who's a fabulous graphic designer, and we had an identity in 3 days. And then we were off to the races. But what we did is we started interviewing the designers, accidental designers or professional designers that had a direct impact or influence in the pandemic, starting from, for instance, Alisa Eckert, who's one of the 2 illustrators at the Center for Disease Control at the CDC in Atlanta that gave the coronavirus its branding. The coronavirus is a gray blob with dots around it. And they are the ones that made it with Dave Higgins and Elisa Eckert. They made it into this deep water mine, you know, really menacing with the red S proteins. So something really that could scare the world. Or we interviewed the anesthesiologist from Bologna that is responsible for designing the split ventilator valve. There were also efforts here in New York at Cornell Hospital and many places in the world. But in typical Italian fashion, the anesthesiologist had a friend who had a little company near Bologna that made plastic objects. So in like 24 hours, they had the valve. And so on and so forth. We interviewed all of these people that were contributing. And then we had specials for other tragedies that happened, from the Beirut blast to the fires in California. And it became this living and breathing portraits of whatever is going on in the world, because as we know very well, emergencies are connected to each other in many different ways, and there's a complex system behind it. And it became really ongoing. Then it became a special issue of Wallpaper, and from that came a whole book. And we keep going and evolving. We moved slightly from the focus on the pandemic to a focus on the world, on making the world a better place, you know, because we've been talking about these long-term, long-durée projects, and Hans Ulrich mentioned them. They're so important. And it's very funny because there are many references to that in the world of art. But I often think of slow food, you know, as a way to really explain it to the world, right? You really need to think long term. And maybe one of the best things to convince everybody of the need for this long term is to think of food systems. And Alice and my ambition is to explain to as many people as possible that design is not embellishment. It's not something that you put together at the end like a ribbon, but it's rather part of the DNA of life, and something that you encounter every time you move, breathe, look around your house, or take any action, and therefore should be taken more seriously. And we always look for opportunities for that to happen. So thinking of food as a metaphor is very important, because you need to reach people where it really feels to them. And that's why also video games are powerful. You know, so there are these actions that transcend the world of design or transcend the world of art. Artists are often considered by popular culture removed and in ivory towers. Designers are considered either problem solvers or embellishers. And we all thrive to instead be seen as citizens that are fundamental to the destinies of society. So this is how Design Emergency evolved and happened. And the feed is still online, design.emergency. We keep on feeding it. And we're thinking of very different platforms, many different platforms on which to carry on our search. So that's for Design Emergency. Then there's everything else that you asked, but we can address it according to how you moderate.
I want to ask you both about both Never Alone, your show, and World Building, yours, Hans Ulrich. But you mentioned food, and I want to throw an interesting thing on the table. Of course, the big theme on the conference here has been the role of machine learning and AI in visual art. Yesterday, we spent time on that in music with Yacht. And also going on in San Francisco is a lot of work in synthetic biology, in the future of food. And people are realizing you can synthesize flavors and new kinds of proteins, but you need an artist to tell you if it's any good. These artists tend to be called chefs, right? So we see this tight relationship between the bio world and chefs in figuring things out. But then people started wondering, if we did use lots of chefs as training data, maybe we could automate the creation of these new foods and flavors, and the same set of acceleration and perhaps extraction that we see going on in DALI and in other areas may come to synthetic biology. So in a way, we see it across the board of technologies, just showing up on the radar. Thought I'd put it out there to you.
I think luckily the fact that it's food will damp down a little bit this whole like, oh yeah, let's like throw it to the wall and see if it sticks, because food ultimately is directly and immediately for the people. So there's going to be kind of a reality check. But you know, synthetic biology is not something that happens today in Silicon Valley and that chefs are brought into Silicon Valley to judge. I mean, it's been going on for a really long time. And in 2008, there was this exhibition called Design and the Elastic Mind, where we showed biodesigners. The biggest lab was at the University of Western Australia at Perth. It was called Symbiotica. It was Oron Katz and Yonat Zur. So these experiments have been going on for a while. Flavors definitely improved, and also applications and textures improved. It's like I remember tasting once upon a time a chip of synthetic meat, and it was pretty disgusting, and now it's getting better. But I think that the applications that are most interesting, Hans Ulrich and I have seen this world of biodesign go from ideas to embryonic startups to now products. And in fashion, you see a lot of it, which is quite amazing. So yeah, the food industry will get there, but because food is so directly involving people's tastes, it's really, it's a little more complicated.
We're going to table this for another conference because it's such a rich thing. Let's talk about both of your shows. We just spent the last 2 years accelerating into the virtual world, living virtually, and your show, Never Alone, came out. It's taken from a video game with kind of a girl exploring a design or an environmental catastrophe, but it takes a hopeful view. Tell us a little bit about that. And Hans Ulrich, I know you saw that recently. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on the role of games here. A lot of the exhibits, or a lot of things we've seen here at Gray Area, are people creating and experimenting with identity and futures in the fluid game environment in which some of the artists prefer to live in.
Well, maybe, why don't you start talking about world building? Because I have a connection between game and something else. So if I go second, it's going to work better. So
Let's talk about world building.
Okay, yes. I mean, and it's interesting just what you said about food, and, also, I think really fascinating the connection to biology, because this is really, would be a great topic for a future kind of conference or dialogue we could have, because we are working actually at the Serpentine on this synthetic ecologies lab, which really looks into natural and artificial biological system. It is a collaboration with Yasaman Sherry, who is actually the project director and Serpentine Synthetic Ecology Lab principal, investigator. And then, of course, the connection to food plays a big role also in our in our Back to Earth project, because we work with cooking sections, and cooking sections have a very direct impact on the menu of our restaurant, and that again is the APG idea, because we connected Benugo, who have not only the Serpentine restaurants but many other restaurants in the UK, and cooking sections, and the projects of the artists are now part of the menu. So it would be exciting to talk about that with Marta. But today, as you suggest, we talk more about gaming. And I think, you mentioned McLuhan initially, and of course, when the early alarm system, McLuhan also says that art as a radar environment takes on the function of indispensable perceptual training. And I discussed it with Namjoon Paik when I visited Paik in 2000, who told me about the necessity actually for technology to liberate the poetic and intercultural capacities. And of course, today, we have a totally new generation of artists who, hopefully liberates in a way the intercultural capacities of technology of our time. And gaming, I think, plays a really crucial role in what Pike called the poetic and intercultural capacities. And I thought it was interesting because I, make studio visits every day, a lot on Zoom, and of course, regularly also actually by visiting the studios, and I realized that more and more artists are inventing their own games. And of course, the aesthetic of games first entered into artistic practice already decades ago, as we can see also in Paola's exhibition. I was very fascinated by this aspect also of memory, because it's not because I think we have more information with technology, we necessarily have more memory. As Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote The Short Century and many other amazing books, always told me, the protest against forgetting is particularly necessary, in this space of technology where there might be amnesia somewhere at the very core. So I was very fascinated by the memory dimension also of Paola's show, because of course artists have integrated the visual language of video games into their works very early on. And we also started the Düsseldorf exhibition and the Met Centre Pompidou exhibition. With that, we started artists who have appropriated, modified, and subverted existing video games in order to reflect them, or also as a détournement, right? To turn them into something completely else than the inventors would have thought. And examples for that would be Störteband. Störteband has very early on done that, or of course, also Jody, and then in the 2000s, someone like Cory Arcage. So we have a whole section which looks into that. And then, of course, the second aspect is that actually artists have presented critique of games by exposing the often discriminatory elements and stereotypical depictions. That's a whole other chapter in the show with Larry Armstrong and David Blandy, for example. That would be an example for that. And then, of course, there is artists who go into these games to actually use them also as a platform. That's, I would say, a third possibility. We can see a lot recently in music, Ariana Grande, for example, with Fortnite, or Demna Gvasalia with Balenciaga. And of course, also the project we did with the Serpentine earlier this year, with Cars and Fortnite and the Cute, where in Fortnite, the Serpentine was basically, the Serpentine North Gallery was built in the gaming space on the landing page, which means that 10 to 50 million people every day were in contact with the Serpentine. There's a lot of visitors in that sense for an art show, 150 million. We've never had as many visitors. And then, of course, it also meant that because the same exhibition happened also in the gallery physically, that all of a sudden visitors who never would have visited an exhibition space before, and also a much younger audience, actually came to see the exhibition. So that's another option. Then, of course, the fourth and certainly main part of the exhibition is this aspect that I mentioned before, that actually artists invent their own video games, and that gave the show also the title, this idea of world building. And I mean, Daniel Braithwaite-Shirley says, to quote Daniel here, I think building worlds digitally, this idea of world building, gives you the chance to think about the foundations that you are constructing on. I often build on top of the words, images, videos, and sounds of Black trans people to ensure that their history is the foundation of the world I'm building, so that it will be able to hold the stories they want to tell. And so I think that's a really important aspect of world building. Gabriel Massan talks about the dynamization of human experience, the diversifying and broadening of our relations to the world. This very Glissantian idea that we can put worlds into contact with worlds through games. Theo Triantifilidis, another young artist in our exhibition who is building worlds, says that he feels that this is a shared vision between actually many different people, that games have been creating the metaverse for a while now. And that's of course, another, I think, really interesting aspect, that video games have been frontlining in a way this whole discussion, which now has become so present with the metaverse, having spent decades already developing, prototyping, and also operationalizing the technologies for the creation of hybrid digital physical experiences that actually involve bodily interaction, often participation, avatars, digital spatial experiences that are seemingly unlimited in scale and imagination, and also the facilitation of multi-party real-time interactions with other users and the digital environment. That comes from our technology report, and actually game technologies are in that sense becoming the fundamental infrastructure for the metaverse in a way. And I think it's interesting if we think about this idea also of participation, because of course a lot of the installations also in world building are mixed reality. They are, and I think that's something we've been seeing a lot in artists working with video games, that they work on mixed reality kind of installation. Kaken is such an example. They've done a very, very complex installation with very, very, physical parts, digital parts, and so on and so on. So that's I think another thing, the future being somehow mixed reality.
What I find really beautiful about the ecosystem of curation that exists is that Hans Ulrich and I are dealing with the same raw material, but then looking at it from very different sides, because Hans Ulrich's exhibition, which I have not seen yet, and I really hope that I can get to it very soon, is about artists' use, interpretation, inhabitation, and envisaging of video games. And instead, the one at MoMA is really more about the baseline. It's about the design of video games, and it's about the collection. So you see here a curator in a collecting institution, a curator instead in Kunsthalle, and working with other collections. It's fascinating because it gives you different angles. The Never Alone is a collection show. So it comes from the collection of video games and other interactive design of the Museum of Modern Art. It's a collection that we started in 2010. And after working on it for 3 years, because once again, when MoMA moves, it moves with, like we say in Italy, with elephant feet, slowly, deliberately, knowing what it's doing. So we had a whole committee, we made a checklist, we kind of like wrote the criteria to collect video games as interactive design. And we started with a collection of 36. And of these 36, they're all on display in these galleries, some as gameplay, some as actual playable games. And they range from some classics. I mean, there's Pac-Man, of course, there's Tempest, and there's Minecraft. But then there's also some indie games. I wouldn't call them artist games. There are artist games in MoMA's collection, like Fenman Bo's Long March, but those are in the other departments. We have, for instance, some indie games by Bennett Foddy, or a game called The War of Mine by 11 Studios that shows and it resonates a lot with what's going on in Ukraine right now. It's a war game where instead of being a soldier shooting, one is a civilian trying to stay alive in a city under siege. Or there's another video game that's called Papers, Please, in which the player is a border agent that has to decide in a few minutes whether to give political asylum or not to an individual in front of them. So they are video games. We consider them as design, meaning that we look at some criteria that range from, of course, form, of course, function, then space and time, because there's this like moving and filmic nature to video games, but also especially to the design of behaviors and how the interaction between mind, body, and machine happens. So it's this different angle, which in the end leads us to the same path that, that Hans Ulrich's exhibition leads us to, which is an idea of what play means and what it can reveal of life. Once again, you know, it's about these experiments for the real world that come from design and come from art. What does it mean to think of yourself playing in a different universe? And as I was preparing for this conversation today, and I realized that I'm moving pretty fast, so I really exhort anybody who's interested to go on the MoMA page for Never Alone and read more about the exhibition and about the division between video games and as design or as art. But it made me realize that it really goes back to process once again, and to what you were telling me, Peter, when we were preparing, not only about McLuhan, but also as a reference to Kynaston McShine's 1970 show Information at MoMA, which we all tend to go back to. The idea of revealing the process of knowledge, which can be acquired by dialogue, by play, by research, by becoming really engaged in the world. And I think that that's what designers and artists can teach everyone. And I wanted, you know, I have here one catalog that Hans Ulrich did of the exhibition about Enzo Mari at the Triennale. Enzo Mari was this designer. Unfortunately, he passed away, how many years? 3 years ago. He was not able to see the exhibition that Hans Ulrich did of him at the Triennale. He died like a few months before. But he was active for a really long time. And I always think of him in the same way that I think of Kynaston, right? Really gruff, really brisk, unless they liked you and unless you needed them, you were like a child or you were in a position whereby you sought their knowledge, and all of a sudden they opened like beautiful flowers and gave you everything that they had learned, which was all about process. And that's what the information exhibition was about. It was about the process of gaining information from artists and on the world. And I know that I'm mixing so many different things together, but I believe that everything that Hans Ulrich and I are doing is about that. There's this yearning, and also Alice, I mean, all of the people that we love and we embrace, this yearning to try and make other people see what we see, because in our own way, we have something to contribute, and also our yearning to see the world the way other people see. And I think that that's what artists could and designers could really teach all of the rest of the world, including powers that be in corporations and in government.
Gaming, of course. Oh, go ahead.
I have your catalog here,
Yeah.
Paola, from the MoMA show.
I have one too. It's in the back of the room.
Right.
I was going to point out that gaming, because it's built on very sophisticated simulation engines, in a way, is one of the few ways to expose people to complex systems, to alternatives, to the nature of environment. That's a big part of what you're doing in Never Alone. And I guess the question I have is, that should be a powerful way to change opinions or motivate society. And I'm wondering if we're optimistic about that. And I'll leave you with this question. Next week, the New York Times is having a climate conference here in San Francisco. And in positioning the conference, they say, technology has transformed lives, but in spite of many promises, it hasn't saved us from the perils yet. Shifts in society often come from art, but will they be able to mobilize change this time around? I thought it was amazing that they came to San Francisco, framed the climate conference around art as the hope. So I'd love both of your thoughts on that as we wrap up.
Impressive. I didn't know that that was going to happen. I would love to understand more about the rationale of coming. I mean, I understand why they came to San Francisco. And is it going to happen this time? Well, I take a very expansive idea of art, as also I know Hans Ulrich does. It's people that are creative. Some are bona fide artists with artist on the passport. Others act like that. But it's that idea of imagination at the power, or at least the power to speak in convincing ways that can do something. I mean, Greta Thunberg showed us, and in a way, hers was by many, and I say it with tremendous respect, considered almost a performance, because it was not only the content, it was the way it was delivered that stopped the world in its tracks, right? So that kind of unusual, intervention in the world is what can do something. What do you think, Hans Ulrich?
Yeah, I completely agree. C.T. Nguyen wrote this book, Games, Agency as Art, and argues that games are kind of unique art forms that offer alternative experience of life and actually, offer also new forms of agency. And I think it's interesting to kind of connect that to Marianne Mazzucato, who talks about a mission-driven economy in her fabulous book. And I do think that this idea of actually mission-driven games, if you think, for example, about Lou Almayan's extraordinary game, Lou Almayan grew up in a refugee camp and has done this extraordinary game, which is actually very much not only about this experience, but also about agency related to that. And if you think about many games right now also address, of course, the extinction crisis, environmental questions, in that sense are also mission-driven. It was fascinating, for example, also in Düsseldorf and for Metz, for the Centre Pompidou, and for the Stoschek exhibition, to work with the Institute of Queer Ecology, a fascinating collective, which actually very much focuses, again, on mission-driven games. So I think that's one thing, and I think in order to do so, we need to go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. And when I was reading your catalog this afternoon, Paola, it was fascinating, for example, to revisit the Biophilia project, which is in your show. And that's such a wonderful example how to actually connect science, to go beyond the divide of two cultures, which C.P. Snow lamented. It starts with the biologist Edward Wilson's and idea of biophilia. And if one looks at the casting of this video, of this project, of this game, it's of course Björk, but it's also our friends Matthias Augustiniak and Michael Amsalak from M&M. They are designers. It's the novelist John, with whom I've worked a couple of years ago, who is an extraordinary novelist in Iceland. Young technologists like Max Weisel, whom I know from 89+, and this is just a small part. So I think this idea also that there is this collaborative, very interdisciplinary, collaborative nature in terms of gaming is interesting. And I think the other aspect, which will also be interesting, will be to see how it actually connects, how it will bring together somehow also the space of blockchain. For example, Sarah Freen, and something Pak also talks about in a recent conversation we did by email with Pak, this idea that actually a blockchain space and the gaming space could maybe merge. And Sarah Freen, the young German artist, she has done these very extraordinary sort of site-specific works for platforms and protocols where sort of software becomes a sculptural medium. And already in 2017 worked with a game which also had blockchain elements to it, and very much questions also this idea of value and is about generosity. So certain of Sarah Frien's works, if they're not given to another person, they actually expire. And I think that's of course interesting. I mean, in relation also to the beginning of how it all began, with the internet. And I had long conversations with Tim Berners-Lee last year about this idea of the internet being for everyone, and Tim Berners-Lee being very worried that the fast internet will no longer be for everyone. And that's of course a lot of, we can see that in a lot of artists also, that they actually work with open source models of games, And if you think, for example, an artist like Sondra Perry, who is also in the exhibition, for Sondra, it's very important that, the work has this open source dimension, is accessible for everyone. I think that's another aspect.
Thank you. We are out of time, but clearly not out of the future or out of the possibilities for further conversation. This has been terrific. I wish you guys were here. The Gray Area Festival 4 years ago was on blockchain and distributed systems and exposed a lot of stuff around privacy and the meaning of money. And I remember back then we were worried if we stuck that word in the title, would anybody come? But that was 4 years ago. And I just want to wrap up by telling you one story. In 1983, I was teaching a class to members of Congress about computing. And Al Gore was the Congressional Clearinghouse of the future. And I said, why do you want to hear about it? You don't care about bids or bauds. He goes, no, but someone says, look, Congressman, here's a report. The ozone hole will disappear. What do we do about it? So we taught a class and we built computer games around the environment and around social security systems. And I remember showing this to Congress people, and none of their short-term things worked. And they're like, we're really glad we get elected every 2 years because this long-term thinking thing doesn't fit with what we do. And okay, that's stuck with me ever since. Thank you very much. We will continue this in Europe, in New York, and here. Thanks. And back over to you, Barry.
Thank you.